And so we're just going to start with Claudia reading from the book, and just to get her voice in the room.
Well, thank you all for coming out today, this morning. I'm full of gratitude. Thank you. So, I feel like I have one shot. Okay. I'll read this piece. It was written because I was curious to know if in the white body there were moments where, if inside the white body there were moments when whiteness knew that it was behaving because it was white. Like there was so I asked a friend who I walk with, because she owns one of these white bodies. And I said, can you tell me a time when you know that something that you're doing because you are white? And she said, well, in LA, not so much, but when I'm in New York, I know that when I enter public transportation and I see that empty seat next to a black body, I sit in it. There's a sort of scan that happens in me. And I said, well, it's funny, because when you think about the black man body, that's something I do myself. So then we had a really, for me, great discussion about the ways in which bodies try to, white or black or whatever color, try to step into a breach in the fabric of America, into places that as ordinary everyday citizens, we know there's a problem, a rooted problem, and we do what we can. And what we can means we take our body and we put it somewhere. On the train, the woman standing makes you understand there are no seats available. And, in fact, there is one. Is the woman getting off at the next stop? No. She would rather stand all the way to Union Station. The space next to the man is the pause in a conversation you are suddenly rushing to fill. You step quickly over the woman's fear, a fear she shares. You let her have it. The man doesn't acknowledge you as you sit down because the man knows more about the unoccupied seat than you do. For him, you imagine it is more like breath than wonder. He has had to think about it so much, you wouldn't call it thought. When another passenger leaves his seat and the standing woman sits, you glance over at the man. He's gazing out the window into what looks like darkness. You sit next to the man on the train, bus, in the plane, waiting room, anywhere. He could be forsaken. You put your body there in proximity to, adjacent to, alongside. You don't speak unless you are spoken to, and your body speaks to the space you fill, and you keep trying to fill it, except the space belongs to the body of the man next to you, not to you. Where he goes, the space follows him. If the man left his seat before Union Station, you would simply be a person in a seat on a train. You would cease to struggle against the unoccupied seat. When, where, why, the space won't lose its meaning. You imagine if the man spoke to you, he would say, "It's okay, I'm okay. You don't need to sit here." You don't need to sit, and you sit and look past him into the darkness the train is moving through, a tunnel. All the while the darkness allows you to look at him. Does he feel you looking at him? You suspect so. What does suspicion mean? What does suspicion do? The soft gray green of your cotton coat touches the sleeve of him. You are shoulder to shoulder, though standing, you could feel shadowed. You sit to repair whom? Who? You erase that thought. And it might be too late for that. It might be too late or too early. The train moves too fast for your eyes to adjust to anything beyond the man, the window, the tiled tunnel, its slick darkness. Occasionally a white light flickers by like a displaced sound. From across the aisle tracks, room, harbor, world, a woman asks a man in the rows ahead if he would mind switching seats. She wishes to sit with her daughter or son. You hear, but you don't hear, you can't see. It's then the man next to you turns to you. And as if from inside his own head, you agree that if anyone asks you to move, you'll tell them, we're traveling as a family.
I wanted to ask you this, and I think this might be a good time, is the use of the second person. It's very striking to start reading the book and to see all these microaggressions told in second person.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that choice?
It wasn't a choice initially. I think I started working in the first or in the third person, and then I realized that the struggle of the text was, how do you get a reader not to think they already know? Because I think these are old problems, they're ancient, and they have stayed with us, now we can say centuries, right? And so how do we re-enter in a way that allows us to have to interrogate again? And the second person allowed that, because it meant that the reader had to say, this person is doing that and that person is doing that. And I perhaps see myself standing here. And so those people who said they didn't see race, I don't see race. You're a little obsessed by race because I only see human beings. Began to say things like, well, that person must be the black person, or that body must be the brown body, or that's probably a white guy. And then suddenly race enters the space. And then one has to take a position around whether or not one is capable of holding the actions of one of those people. So that was the sort of the thinking behind the second person. But another part of me loved this idea that if you're talking about sort of minorities, that you're actually talking about the second person, that the position of the other is the second person. So on a sort of language level, there was that kind of sort of deliciousness around the way that second person met the use of the word other.
The role of the citizen, or the responsibility of the citizen, is to notice things and to speak about them. And that's a role that you've been put in since the publication of the book. I don't know how many printings it's had now. Is it
I think
4?
6.
6?
It might be up to 6.
It's phenomenal. And there's been a change on one of the pages. In the recent editions of the book, there are more in memories. There's not just Jordan Russell Davis. There's now Eric Garner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, and then the list goes on.
Walter Scott is outside the list, but inside the list, yeah.
And so there's something of a first responder energy to the book that's kind of, I think, sending waves through America. But then also on that facing page, can you talk about what you've done in recent printings of the book?
Well, I after the killing of Mike and Brown, I was thinking about Darren Wilson, and you might remember he said it was as if a demon was coming, and I saw him, and I saw Hulk Hogan, and so I began to think, what's going on inside that head of his, And I don't mean it, I think it's important. And so I really was just thinking about those statements. And so I wrote down because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying. And I thought it was the first line to something that I would continue to think about this and think about Darren Wilson's statements. But then everything else I wrote seemed to fall back into, because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying. And then that, do you remember the other policeman asked the black guy to get his license, and the guy reaches in the car to get his license, and the man shoots him? And then you have the audio recording, and the black guy says to him, "Why did you shoot me?" And he said, "Because you reached into your car." And he said, "But you asked me to get my license." And in the voice of the white policeman, you also hear a kind of confoundedness. Like he too is like, I don't know why this happened. And you can hear it. You can hear it. And so, which is, I think, a very different kind of body than the white policeman who shot Walter Lamar. I mean, we could see that when he picked up the taser and dropped it by Lamar's body. So I'm not saying that there is one body, one white body in terms of this kind of interrogation. But that led me to want to think about what is happening inside the white imagination relative to the black and brown body. But that moment itself is itself. And so I ended up just moving it into a very loose haiku and replacing that in the later edition of the book.
And so, but you took out the justice system, right? Is that right?
I did take out the justice system. Initially, the page read, "In memory of Jordan Russell Davis" on one side, and then on the other side, it said, it had the dates of the justice system. That case, if you remember, that was the case where the white guy, let's call him that, the white guy, saw Russell in the car playing music with his friends, and he shot him. So he shot and he claimed that he was afraid, and that's why he killed him. And initially he got off, but then the case, somehow, I don't remember exactly how it went, but now he's in jail. So it seemed like the justice system had actually shown up on that one. So it didn't seem correct to leave it there for that case. So that led to the desire to change it, to be more accurate. You know, I think when you are, as you say, being a first responder, you want to kind of first respond with as much information as you have. And since we had more information, I thought, well, we can change it.
Very powerful images throughout. And then at the end, you have these scripts of situation videos, which can watch online. And they're also very powerful with the techniques of slowing down the action and the voiceover coinciding. So there's a lot of visual, theatrical energy in the book. And so I wondered if you could talk about the images, and is this different from your other work?
Well, I love Bridget for saying I'm a visionary, but actually, I think Blake also had poems and images, and in his case, maybe a little bit more illustrative, I think. So there has been a kind of line coming down. What's different, I think, about Citizen and the use of images here has to do with the generosity of the visual arts community. Many of them I had to get permission to use. All of them I had to get permission to use. And because of that, I feel that it opens out the space, the discursive pace of the page, so that it really is a conversation between the many minds that supplied the stories in this text and the sort of amazing creative minds that created the visual pieces. So I loved that the inclusion of the images meant an opening out of a conversation, and a conversation that one couldn't control. That also was exciting to me, because I have absolutely no idea what Bridget took from the images that she saw. I mean, I know why I use them, but that doesn't account for what will happen when somebody else interacts with the text and the image. So it makes it the space much more alive for me, and that was exciting. The sense that one cannot and does not want to control the reader. That let it take them where it takes them. In terms of how it's different from the other work, I think that in Citizen, for me, the stakes are a little higher. I was very concerned with having the images enter the work authentically. So I was interested in what generated the work itself. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Nick Cave. I used a piece of his work. I don't know if this is the Nick Cave piece. He does these pieces that they're actual garments, exquisitely made, and he calls them sound suits. And I was really interested in why he made them. And it took me a long time to track down interviews, and there wasn't a lot of writing around it. But finally I found an interview where he said that after the beating of Rodney King, he thought, well, if it's only just about the color of people's skin, why don't we create garments that will cover that up, and we can start again. We'll just start over. And so he made these sound suits, and they literally cover you from head to foot. And that was supposed to sort of clear the space. Why is that interesting to me? There's a fantastic theorist called Robin Kelly. He wrote a book called Freedom Dreams. The last chapter of the book talks about the way that the only way out of this kind of systemic racism that is equal to what it means to be American is to make some kind of surreal jump. That we can't seem to work it out inside. So we're going to have to jump. And it seemed like Nick Cave had jumped. So I was really interested in the sort of backstory behind the pieces. The Ligon pieces were taken at the Million Man March, or one of them was, he used the text from Zora Neale Hurston, I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a stark right background. So there was a real sort of historical conversation going on in the use of the different pieces.
I'm curious about the choice. I mean, in some ways it seems perfect, as does the closing text, prose poem. I can hear the even breathing. Maybe you would read that for us, and then talk a little bit about the choice of the Turner painting at the end of the book. For now, for this entity, this is the end. So maybe you could read this last page and talk about the painting.
Okay. No, it's true. It was impossible to end this book. My friend Karen Green is in the back, and she knows. I was talking constantly, like, how do you get out of here? And I had another friend who kept saying, oh, just write some more of those microaggressions. I'm like, you can't. I'm not going to just keep writing those. So I was thinking, I literally would be thinking, like, how do you end this? Because you don't want to suggest artificially that there is an ending. that there is any way in which one can reconcile these things happening day to day for these bodies. I can hear the evening breathing that creates passages to dreams. And yes, I want to interrupt to tell him, her, us, you, me, I don't know how to end what doesn't have an ending. Tell me a story, he says, wrapping his arms around me. Yesterday, I begin. I was waiting in the car for time to pass. A woman pulled in and started to park her car facing mine. Our eyes met, and what passed as quickly as the look away. She backed up and parked on the other side of the lot. I could have followed her to worry my question, but I had to go. I was expected on court. I grabbed my racket. The sunrise is slow and cloudy, dragging the light in, but barely. Did you win? He asks. It wasn't a match, I say. It was a lesson. And that was one of those things, those moments where I wrote down exactly what happened. I went to have my tennis lesson, and I was sitting in the car eating a banana and thinking, how do I end the end of the book? And this woman drove up, and she looked at me, and then she backed up.
Deus ex machina.
Yeah, and I thought, this is kind of silly, but I jumped out of the car and I said, I know, I'm going to ask her why she did that. And I started walking towards her car, which probably freaked her out even more. Like, oh my God, the big black lady's coming after me. But then I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be late. Ross, who I take lessons from, would have not been happy. So I just thought, oh, I can't do both things. And then what is she really going to say to me? You're right, I am a racist. I'm really sorry. And the book ends with this image by Turner. I think, isn't Turner at the Getty right now? Yeah, I need to get over there. I love Turner. I've always loved Turner. You know, I always felt like there's a thing, like you can be a Constable person and you can be a Turner person. And I've always been a Turner person because Turner's so moody and everything's so cloudy, you know, so I was thinking about this image as the final image because it seemed to me it embodied what it meant to move through a landscape, or a seascape in this case, where you think you see what you see, and in fact, it looks nice. There's something very beautiful about this image if you just glance at it. So it holds a kind of normalcy and even beauty. But then when you are pulled in to examine what is actually happening, you see that in this case, the slaves have been thrown overboard, which was a practice that was engaged for two reasons. One, if you had sick and dying slaves on a slave ship and you arrived, nobody would buy them, obviously. So it would just be property that was dead, literally. But if you toss them overboard, then you could say the insurance would have to pay for them. That would be lost property. So there was that practice of just tossing anybody who was failing in any way overboard. And in this case, there was a storm coming. He felt he was going to... people were ill on the boat, and he dumped all of the black bodies. When he arrived, the owner of the property, the black bodies, was like, what happened to my property? Hey. And the other shipmate said it was his decision to throw them out. So he was put on trial for that. But Turner actually was upset that they were killing the black bodies. And so you got to like him, to move it out of the realm of commodity and into the human realm where it started and should stay. So that was, and you can, when I went to purchase the image, you can purchase it with a detail. And it seemed to enact this idea of what happens when you start to be conscious, what happens when you look, what happens when you interrogate actually what's going on. There it is. And because all of this shit is happening because of visual triggers, right? It's just, oh, she's got brown skin. Oh, she's black. It's just visual. I wanted to end in a visual moment. And that's why the visuals are important to this book, because it is at the source of the bias and the racism.
Is this last piece the only time that you write in first person?
It is.
Okay.
That inside the macroaggressions, it was a moment of owning that I. Toni Morrison talks a lot about not being interested in the white gaze. And many of her books, in fact, have very few white people in there. But, I as much as I'm a lover of Toni Morrison, there's no way that this work is possible without Morrison's work and also her critical work, Playing in the Dark. I think that it's a false construction to act as if I am not interacting with white bodies all the time, including my husband's. So, that would be problematic. So but one can own the eye, and one does own the eye relative to oneself. So I did want to do a kind of corrective around that.
I read an interview with Lauren Berlant,
Berlant,
and with her work on trauma. And while I think that the subject of the book is race, the subtext is trauma, and that traumatic re-experiencing of these beliefs or these deeply unconsciously held behaviors that are enacted on a daily basis. I think it's a new thing, a rare thing to bring trauma and racism together in this way, and it must be an ongoing trauma. So, if you could talk about that a little bit.
That's a great question, and also a huge one. As you're speaking, my mind is like shh. You see, there it is. Well, I've always been interested in trauma. I don't know how many people have watched that film Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. It's an 8-hour documentary in which Lanzmann has gathered together people who are more or less the last survivors of the camps. And so many of them, are getting on in age. And he wants them to tell him exactly what has happened to them. And they have moved on in the sense that they have grown up kids and moved to Israel, in the case of one guy, a barber. And somehow that information was locked down. And Lanzmann's mission was to get them to retell exactly what happened to them. And he made a decision in that documentary not to use any historical footage, So he was reliant on those people to bring forward everything, the history, the emotional space, the pragmatic details of of those moments. And so the documentary is really about watching Landsman on a certain level, getting people to enter the site of trauma and to hold that place. And he would ask them questions, and they would be happy to speak to a certain point, and then they would stop. And he would say, no, you have to, what happened next? Like, so the Nazis said, dig up that area. And you went to dig up the area, and then what happened? And the person would just be like, that's it, I'm done. Thank you, I've told you everything I need to tell you. Goodbye. And Landman was like, no. What happened next? What happened? And the body would break down. It would literally break down. They would start crying. They would not be able to go on. And you would wait. You would wait with them until they would say something like, as I started to shovel in the dirt, I saw the body of my wife. It was one of those, even I'm remembering him say it, and it breaks my heart still. And so I was really interested in how narrative, how the actual storytelling is tied to the holding of the grief and the trauma. And so I wanted, in a way, to collect these stories, my own and the stories of my friends, because these moments, even though they're small in the sections that contain the microaggressions, they're also heartbreaking, because they often happen between you and a friend, you and a colleague, you and a moment in the day that is not supposed to be spectacular, that's supposed to be ordinary, that's supposed to allow you to pass through. And then it gets all gummed up. And you spend all of your time trying to get past it so you can do the next thing. I mean, I began to think of white privilege actually as mobility, as the ability to just move through life with the normal stresses that are human stresses, without this added thing that has to be negotiated by brown and black bodies every day. And it is every day in some way. So that's how I was thinking about trauma in relationship to this text. There's also John Henryism. A friend told me this phrase, that John Henryism is the idea that black bodies have to work hard just to get through their lives. And so the stresses that get built up around that become actual physical things, like high blood pressure, for example. And within the medical community, this is recognized as a syndrome. It's an actual syndrome. In fact, somebody from the Harvard School of Health called me up and said that he was going to use this book in his classes now in order to talk about that. And also, the psychiatric convention next year, whatever that is, called me and asked me if I would come and talk. So that sense of the accretion and what that accretion of bias does to the body is something that the text, in an underground way, is interested in. And it's something that Lauren Ballant, the critic in Cruel Optimism, writes about. she's very interested in the ways in which the body acts out relative to its own frustrations and trauma.
In the book, different characters or different voices advise the noticing voice to stop noticing. Just stop, don't pay attention. Get along, go along. Don't register it. But there's this insistence on, I don't know if it's an insistence, but it's a registering of it over and over. And two of the figures who are deeply registered, one is Serena Williams through the lyric essay and the visuals, and the other is the situation video of Zinedine Zidane. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you chose sports figures. What is it about these athletes?
Well, it's not so much the sports figures themselves, it's sports. The fact that those things are documented and replayed. So if the difficulty is, wait, did she just say that? And then you say, did you just say that? And they're like, what? I didn't say anything. And you're like, oh, I thought I heard you say something, but okay. Whereas in sports, you can replay it. That's the thing about sports. Something happens, and they're like, wait, and then they replay it. And so it's easy to document and look at and address the questions of these moments of aggression that happens within a space using sports figures. So in Zidane World Cup, that was, do you guys remember that? That was the World Cup, and Maserati, the Italian player, says something to Zidane, and nobody knows what was said. But Zidane walks by him, decides not to let it go, whatever it was, turns around, comes back, and headbutts him. And then they're also dramatic in soccer, right? So then Maserati falls down, but he was able to get up a second later, so clearly. But so it was almost like ballet. It was beautifully enacted. But in the space of the time between that action and the public finding out what was said, everything erupted in terms of race. Everybody, the newspaper, the chat lines, everything was like, oh, he called him a dirty Arab. He called him a nigger. He called him this. He called him that. And they brought in lip readers. And the lip readers said, yeah, that's what he said. He said he was a dirty Arab. He said, that's what they saw the lips saying. And to me, that was fascinating. It was like, race, everybody knows that racism is right under the surface of these interactions. And so the minute there is discomfort and confrontation, the language of racism comes in. It turns out that what he said was, your sister is a whore. And that is also fascinating, because Frantz Fanon, in writing about European racism, said that the way the European will get at the Algerian is by insulting the women in their families. So, in a sense, he did enact a moment of racism in exactly the way Fanon had documented it would occur back in 1940s when he wrote Black Skin, White Mask. So that's sort of my interest in sports. I'm also now interested in sports because I became interested in sports. That how those things happen. So in watching Serena Williams, I became a huge tennis fan. And so then I started playing tennis, and I love tennis. And now I'm a huge fan of Rafael Nadal. If anybody afterwards wants to talk about whether you think he's going to be able to win the French Open again this year, I'm yours.
And it also brings you and the reader into a larger conversation because there's so much interest around sports.
Exactly. It's a national treasure.
We're approaching the end here, so I will just say, as is your book, Claudia, it's a book that I think hearing you read from is such a privilege. The tone and the work that went into it, which we didn't even touch on, the process. There's so much to talk about here, as you know. So thank you for being attentive, and let's give a warm thank you to Claudia.